Dr. Sage, could you please introduce yourself to us and tell us a little about your work?
Sure. I'm Dr. Sage Breslin. I am a trauma psychologist by training, and I now specialize in helping re empower women who have been really devastated by narcissistic abuse and toxic relationships.
Could you briefly describe to us your diagnostic odyssey?
So I'm guessing that you're asking about my multiple myeloma,
Yes.
correct? Yes, bone marrow cancer. So I noticed for about a year, uh, I was in practice and I had a very busy practice. I noticed that I was becoming more and more exhausted. There were times where I would get to 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon and I felt like I didn't know how I was even going to stay awake for one more session, much less two or three. There were days where I couldn't drive home because I simply couldn't trust that I wouldn't fall asleep on the drive. And, while that never happened, it was that level of fatigue that was really frightening. Um, and I started to ask my doctors, what is this? Should I be concerned? This is crazy. I mean, is it my thyroid? Is it, what's going on? And, you know, doctor after doctor said, there's nothing wrong with you. We've done blood tests. There's nothing wrong with you. And so I'd go to the next person. There's nothing wrong with you. Perhaps you're depressed. I was going through a divorce. I said, no, actually, I feel better about my life than I ever have. I'm not depressed. I'm not anxious. I just am completely exhausted. That was 2016 where I really started to notice an uptick in those symptoms. And by 2017, I had also noticed bruises, tiny bruises all over my body, but maybe the size of a dime. And it was, I'm not a klutz. I'm fairly careful when I move around, so I couldn't think of like where these bruises were coming from. And I began to do some research just from my own intuition and my own medical knowledge. And I started to think, this looks a lot like a blood cancer. And I continued to ask, specialists even, if maybe there were tests that they needed to run. And each and every one said, there's nothing wrong with you. So in June, the end of June in 2017, I had a medical emergency, I guess we'll call it. And I'd been having a very rough time with my ex husband. We'd been trying to do some counseling because we were still co parenting. And I had had a headache for about 5 days. And my brother is a physician, and at one point in time, I had said to him, I think it was like a Tuesday night, I said, kind of had this headache for 5 days. I don't really know what to do about it. And he panicked and he said, that could be a subarachnoid hemorrhage, whatever that means, right? I know now what it means. And he said, you've got to go to the hospital right away. And I said, it's been 5 days. I'm not going to get up from my bed and go to the hospital. And it was night. And he said, you promised me you go tomorrow. And I had tried to get in with my primary care, but I was pretty well. So I hadn't seen her. And they said, no, we can't see you because you haven't been in the last 2 years. And I remember thinking, what? But I'm sick, like there's something wrong. And they just said, well, you'll have to go to urgent care or the emergency room. And I remember thinking, okay, I know where the urgent care is. I'll go, but I have this appointment. So I did the therapy appointment. And as I came out of the therapy appointment, I thought, okay, I've got just enough time to get to this, urgent care where they're probably going to tell me to take 2 Tylenol. And then I'm going to go on to the baseball game for my kids. So I get there and, even though I have an appointment, they make me wait an hour. And I'm thinking, I should just skip this and just go to the baseball game. But I don't. I get in the room. They do what most doctors do, which is they took my vitals. And my blood pressure at the time was 210/105. And I remember the nurse kind of going white as a sheet, and she's like, "Call 911. We need an ambulance." And I'm looking around for who needs the ambulance. And she said, "We are quite certain you're going to have a stroke now." And I said, I drove an hour to get here. Like, I didn't have a stroke on the way. And she said, "All of your symptoms tell us that you're going to have a stroke." And I said, "So what do you want me to do?" And they said, "You need to go to the emergency room right away." And I said, "Okay, well, just drive there." And she said, "You can't drive there. You can, you could die and endanger other people." And I said, "It's 2 miles away, and I'll stay in the right-hand lane." So off I went. I went in. I still have a pretty bad headache. I went in and I said, it called ahead. The doctor said, I might be having a stroke. Right into a room. They start, they got an IV, they're taking blood, they're doing all sorts of tests. And, then I'm told, well, you're not going to leave. You're going to be here. We're going to give you some medication to take your blood pressure down. We're going to treat this very seriously. At the end of the day, they hooked me up with a cardiologist, and they just said, "We're not sure what's going on. We have to put me in a CT, right? There's no subarachnoid hemorrhage. I haven't had a stroke. If they can get my blood pressure down, they feel certain I'll be okay." So they send me home eventually, 6 hours later. And I then, over a period of 8 weeks, am in and out of the hospital for 3 to 5 days at a time. I am put through every cardiac and, test they're known to mankind, until they finally do an angiogram to take a look at my heart to see, what is causing this problem. And because I can't take any form of opiates, they do this with Benadryl. And I wake up during the procedure right as they're going into my heart. And then they give me more Benadryl. And they keep me overnight. And when they come in the next morning, they say to me, "We've discovered there's nothing wrong with you." At which point in time, they should have been worried about my blood pressure, because I became very, very angry. And by this time, I'm quite certain I understand that my body has revolted, you know, to prove a point that there is really something wrong with me, and they're not looking for it. So they send in the social worker, which he was a lovely man. Um, and I tried to be very calm when I told him that if he didn't leave the room, I would become very emotional and aggressive, because, in fact, there is something wrong with me. And he willingly left. So there I am. I'm waiting to be discharged, and the hospitalist comes in to discharge me, and she said, "I've been looking at your paperwork, because you've been in and out of this hospital for quite a few times over the last 8 weeks, and you've had all of these CBCs done. And I'm looking at your white blood cell count, and it's circling the drain. I'm really worried that your bone marrow may be compromised." And I look at her and I said, "Okay," because I'm thinking like, "Hello, yes, you're right." And she said, "So we're gonna emergently refer you to an oncologist, hematologist, so they can take a look at that." So on Halloween, October 31st in 2017, I am there, and they are going to do a bone marrow biopsy, which I later find out is going to be in the office with no sort of sedation. I don't suggest this, by the way. And they do it. They get the sample. And a week later, I'm back in the office, and this particular oncologist, God help me, I hope she's not still working, um, says to me, I'm reading the results, and there's nothing wrong with you. There's a benign protein in your bloodstream, and that's all there is. And I said, "I can't concentrate. I can't keep my head up after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I've got bruises all over my body, and my white blood cell count is now almost 0. And she said, "Yeah, well, you might want to try some acupuncture, maybe get massage, maybe get some therapy, because there's nothing wrong with you." And I remember leaving in tears. You'd think you'd be overjoyed if somebody's telling you there's nothing wrong with you. It took me 16 months to find a specialist. At the time, there were only 2 specialists, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, for multiple myeloma, because then I knew that's what I had. And I called the office. I'm in tears. I've dropped my kids off at a baseball game, and I was going to go grocery shopping. I get all the way to the store. I'm in the parking lot. I don't have enough energy to get up and grocery shop for my children. And I call the office and I tell them what's going on. And she said, "Well, who's the referring doctor?" And I said, "That would be me." And she said, "No, like, aren't you good? Aren't you seeing another oncologist? You've called us. We're specialists, in this." And I gave them the name of this oncologist. And she was very quiet for a minute. And she said, "Oh, we get a lot of referrals from that office. I'm sorry that you've had this experience. We'll see you next week." I go in. They want to repeat all the tests. So that's what we do. A week later, I'm sitting with the specialist, Dr. Caitlin Costello. And she said, I'm sorry to let you know that you have multiple myeloma. And I looked at her and she said, do you understand what I'm saying? You have bone marrow cancer. And I looked at her and blinked and I said, "How long have I had that?" And she said, "Well, at least as long as October 31st, 2017, when they did the first biopsy, if not before that," because she described symptoms before that. And I said, "How is it that I had this biopsy and I was told there was nothing wrong with me?" So much so that doctor before, she wouldn't even sign disability paperwork for me, not even the state disability, not even a private disability, because she told me outright, "There's nothing wrong with you." So once I was finally with a specialist who actually knew how to read a report, then I had to really start looking at what this diagnosis meant for me and for my children. I had 5 children. I was a single mother. And, that's where sort of the next phase of this odyssey stepped in, is when I finally found somebody who saw me, who heard me, who diagnosed me correctly, and who was available to actually treat the cancer rather than denying its existence.
What did this odyssey teach you about the healthcare system?
Well, um, I think initially I just felt like this is broken. This is broken beyond repair. When I found the specialist, by advocating for myself, I mean, I am a healthcare provider. I've got additional medical training. If I had not been that person, I think I'd be dead today. What I found when I found the right specialist for the disease, I found a space that was, like heaven, honestly. They cared about me, they listened to me, they treated me accurately. That once I found what I was looking for, once I found what I needed, I found a system that was working quite well. I mean, initially there were, medications that they wanted that the insurance denied, and they just said, "Uh-oh, we'll have to get a team on that." I ended up calling the manufacturer of the chemotherapy they wanted to give, and they said, "Oh, you've got the diagnosis. Yes, we'll provide it to you, $10 a time." And this was something that I think they were charging about $30,000 per treatment. So, I found these beautiful resources and opportunities once I had advocated for myself. But had I been unable to do that, had I been just a regular Jane Smith, I really truly think I would have been dead. I think the system would have absolutely failed me.
Another question is about the if you have ever got asked from the medical healthcare professionals, including your oncologist, about your life rather than only your condition, Dr. Sage, so that your treatment could be personalized according to your wishes, needs, and values. I'll give you just some examples of the questions that maybe one of them at least ask you, like how you understood your illness, what your greatest fears were, what goals and priorities mattered most, or what outcomes would feel unacceptable, and what you were or were not willing to sacrifice.
Yeah, certainly not with that first, medical office where I, was misdiagnosed. Once, though, I found this specialist, I felt they were very much attuned to me as a human, not just me as a medical condition. They got to know all about me, my history, my children, my family, where I lived, what I did for a living. Um, I was born clairvoyant. It's just a thing. I didn't ask for it. It just happened. And, I'm very, very, very sensitive to medication, as was my mother. And, this is something that they learned about. And when I told them, before I ever started any chemotherapy, I told them about that. They were intrigued, oftentimes people are, but they immediately said, "Oh, okay, well, given that level of, sensitivity to your own body and to the energy around you, we're gonna have to really be very mindful that we don't overdose you." And so I went to a local infusion center. They got to know me as a person. They started with very, very low doses to determine how I would respond so that I wouldn't have any overt reaction. And in fact, sadly, a day before the transplant, I was given a dose of melphalan. It's called the marrow killer. Very, very, very strong chemotherapy. But I had it at the hospital. So these were not people who knew me. And they gave me a standard dose. And despite the fact that I ran up a fire hill with my dog the day before my transplant, the day before getting this melphalan, I was then in the hospital 3.5 weeks and left in a wheelchair because I developed very, very dire, motor neuropathy as a result of this, what was an overdose. It was a standard dose, but my local team knew me and how I responded to medications, but it didn't occur to anybody to tell the hospital team that. So I feel like, my specialist really did care very deeply about me, about my situations, my desires, my expectations, my family, who was going to be involved. They invited my friend who took care of me for 3 months, they invited her to participate in everything so that she would know what to expect. So that process, I think, actually was maybe even better than I would have hoped for. Um, Afterwards, I mean, the transplant was relatively successful at knocking down some of my numbers, but unfortunately, it became clear that remission was not going to be an option for me. And that part of my journey um, was really devoted to getting quality time with my children before I succumbed to the disease. Luckily, 2 years later, a new medication was, approved by the FDA. I was tried on it, and my body thought that was the best thing ever, and I went into remission about 6 months later, and I'm now in year 3 of my remission. So, you know, I think that it surprised the oncologist, it surprised our team, certainly surprised me and my children, um and I think they'd been great because they were really helping, me try to have the best life I could have, with a very limited lifespan ahead of me. And as things changed, it was interesting how they, said, like, "So you're not gonna have to have biopsies every month or every 6 months," or, you're not gonna have to be on this forever," or, I do have to remain on this treatment. It's a monthly treatment, but it's a small price to pay for being in remission and being able to really embrace life again.
I'm really happy for you, Dr. Sage, to be in the remission phase. You said that you start focusing more on the quality of life and spending extra time with your children. How did your values or priorities change before and after your cancer diagnosis?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the same person that I always was, but I was raised to be a doer. I was raised that you work hard, you do as much as you can do while you still can do it. I very much believed that it was my job as a single mother. I mean, there wasn't anybody else who was paying for the house and the food and the, educational stuff, and that was mine to do. And I really just believed that meant I had to kind of work myself into the ground, and I did. That's why I have cancer. I think that's part of it. I think that once I survived the transplant, I really didn't exactly know where the money was gonna come from, but I really I mean, I had a different kind of come to Jesus meeting. I really started to pray about how I could simply spend more time with my children, making memories, enjoying life, enjoying them, watching them grow up, and being way more present to them than I had been to, say, my career. I had been, I mean, I loved my children, but I saw my responsibilities to provide for them override spending time with them. And once I moved through, the phase of the transplant and then the recovery of the transplant, I just focused on them. I really devoted myself to being a mother, and I worked when I could. I still didn't have much stamina. My stamina is still not great, in year 3, but that is what it is. Um, but I found money, my mom died just before my transplant, and I was not expecting to receive anything of her, but I when I got home, it was about 2 weeks after I got home from the hospital. It was right around Christmas time, right before Christmas, and I received, in the mail, a letter identifying that I was a beneficiary of a small, annuity from my mom. It was so touching, it was gonna be my first Christmas without her, and this present arrived from, this company, and I remember when I looked at the sum, I mean, and it again, I had no money coming in, I was, still on my back in bed, still very, direly ill, and here is this money, and I said to my children at Christmas time, "Look, Nana Meg has given us this money, and I'm gonna set aside most of it to take care of you, in the event that I die. But we are gonna take a little bit of this money, and we are gonna get a trip to Ireland," which is where I had been working with the team there. And I said, "I'm gonna take you. I'm gonna take you with me, and we're gonna travel, and we're gonna see it, and you're gonna feel, part of the homeland, and we're gonna spend this time together." And 11 days with them around the whole island of Ireland, was just the beginning of really awesome devotion to my children. Just a whole different way of learning to live, to be present, to listen, to laugh, to, taste and sample experiences. Hey, come on, kitty. Yeah, that's what it's like working from home. And it just changed everything.
I'm really sorry for your loss, Dr. Sage. Although your mother is not physically present, she is spiritually with us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
In one of the videos on your YouTube channel, you have said that everyone is on their own journey. What has cancer taught you about comparison, and how can people avoid comparing their healing journey, life path, or struggles with someone else?
You know, I will never forget being in the hospital, and, right before I went in, the oncologist told myself and my children that, the next goal was surviving the transplant, and I thought in a way that she was joking. I later learned she was not joking at all, as I was going through that experience, because the woman next door to me died, and that will never leave me. That life is very fragile, and this cancer journey is like a gauntlet. And for some reason, despite the, very unfortunate experiences I had with the medication, I survived, but she didn't. I know other people who haven't survived. And yet I'm still here. And I look at, one of my friends with cancer who was doing well, was told he was just, in perfect works, and then had some very bizarre symptoms kind of show up emergently. And they said, you've got another tumor on your brain, and there's a brain bleed, and you need to go into surgery immediately. And, thank God and touch wood, he's still with us, but that could have been me too. I had a year ago, I had a PET scan and they evidenced a tumor on my liver, a carcinoid tumor. And, I mean, I pray a lot, but I'm also, very focused on supplementation and, remedies. I do the chemotherapy that I'm supposed to. I do the immunotherapy, but I also do use other kinds of supplements to help improve my circumstances. And I started using a supplement to clear the liver. And, 4 months later, they did another test and the mass was gone. So I think in many ways, I don't think any of us can compare our cancer journeys because what happens for me might not happen for the next person. I think what we can celebrate is that most of us have a sense of loss of the well body. I think a lot of us have had fear about what happens next, or will I make it through, or will my children lose me? Um, there are commonalities in the population that's experienced cancer. And there are different cancers. I have a rare cancer, and so there are a few more bells and whistles there than, say, somebody who has a breast cancer. Um, my cancer can't be extracted. I mean, they were able to extract the bone marrow and then regrow it again, but it's a much more difficult, deal. If you have a blood cancer, they don't just drain your blood and put in new blood. That'd be a thing. I mean, they try to clean the blood, but it's not an extractable cancer. So there are a lot of us, I think, with blood cancers that are able to relate to one another very well because those extra bells and whistles are things that we all can talk about. We've all had experiences and we've all had feelings about. But I think, the cancer journey is something that all of us, whether survivors or thrivers, um, we belong to a group that nobody wanted to join, you know, and we are there and available to support one another. I'm very active on LinkedIn with a group called Showing Up Perspectives on Cancer that Tim Stone founded. And we do an annual retreat so that we can support one another and we can laugh and we can play and we can cry, and grieve when we lose one of our members and laugh and celebrate when we have members who achieve goals that they want and, whatever they're celebrating. So, yeah, it's an interesting journey and I don't think that it's a one size fits all.
Was that what you want viewers to take away from this part of your journey?
Um, I mean, I think probably the most important thing that I could offer to anyone is that learning to advocate for yourself is probably the most important thing you can do for yourself, probably with any medical condition. Um, listen to your body, listen to your intuition, and it doesn't matter what somebody says. If somebody is telling you, no, it's not right, no, you're fine, and your body is saying, no, you are not, just keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. Learn as much as you can about what you believe is wrong and don't take no for an answer. If you really are getting all of these signals that tell you to keep looking, commit yourself to it because you're probably right.